Okay. Welcome back to the Azure podcast. Today is the 6th of April, 2021. On Teams with me today, we have myself, Cynthia, Evan, Kale, Suji, and our special guest, Mike Budzynski, to talk about API management. Before getting into our topic, as usual, we have a couple updates we wanted to share. Kale, I know you put in some. Kale, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I got two. One is about Azure Orbital, which is our satellite-based communication stuff. There's been some updates there. They're continuing to deploy more of these satellite ground stations. There's actually a picture in the blog. It's pretty cool. Like you
I
can
know,
see
I
the
saw
satellite.
that. It looks like it reminds me of Epcot Center.
Yeah. It looks like a little mini Epcot, right? So the satellite's inside this little dome that sits inside of there. But basically, this is talking about the expansion, more of these deployed out there, but also some partnerships with this Thales Alena space, which is basically a partnership to bring, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and Azure Orbital together to create solutions. So it's a pretty neat. I won't get into the details here, but it walks through like all the scenarios of not just data acquisition, but the analytics and AI and things running on top of that provides the real business value for, what this service can offer.
Yeah, and we are working on getting somebody from the Azure for Operators team on the show. We're working on getting that scheduled later for our audience.
Nice. The second one is kind of cool because it talks a little bit. At first, when I saw the headline, I thought, oh, this is we talked to the folks about, and I forget the name of the product, but our data centers that were deployed in the ocean. But it was basically around this two-phase immersion cooling. But it's actually not about that. If you read the article, it's actually really cool. I think some learnings from that maybe helped, but it talks about not to get into the technicals, but a one-phase cooling approach would be something like a radiator or like an air conditioning system where you're circulating some liquid, and then basically it's going out and being cooled and coming back in, and circulating. And this two-phase is something that happens passively, basically like as something hits this hot unit, it turns into vapor, goes and condenses and comes back down. So it's a pretty neat kind of talk through about the technicals of that. And I guess Microsoft's kind of pioneering some tech in this area. I think they have this running in Redmond or in Washington anyway, at small scale right now to see, the problems with air cooling are numerous, right? And so they've been experimenting with different ways on cooling techniques, along with the ocean stuff that we've talked about before.
And I think you were referring to Project Natick, right? That we had on the
there you go.
Ben Cutler on the show a while ago. Yeah, I had to look it up myself.
Yeah.
And the seal picture.
Yeah.
And I also had one update around the general availability for cloud services on extended support. So this is a new Azure Resource Manager based deployment, ARM-based deployment for Azure Cloud Services, which are people that started on the platform really early on in the Azure days. And there's also a migration tool from the classic cloud services into the extended support cloud services migration tool. There are currently two different migration paths. One is to redeploy, and you also have the option to do some in-place migrations. There's a lot more details in the blog post that we'll also include in the show notes. Any other updates?
I'll have to say, I totally forgot that the original cloud services didn't have to be in VNets. Like, that has been so long, and I'll have to confess, we joke about this within some of the folks I know that have been doing this for a while. Like, back then, we thought there was this whole different deployment model, and the software-defined network was different for VMs that weren't a VNet, weren't in a VNet. In hindsight, we looked really silly with that conversation, but it's just sort of amazing sort of how things have evolved here.
And having said that, I think we've talked about it before on the show that cloud services, I think, is still the best kind of paths Microsoft, the Azure has, right? It is true PaaS. That's what we all aim for in a PaaS system, and so that it's no wonder why a lot of companies want to hold on to cloud services. It offers so much in terms of reliability, fault tolerance. It just happens under the covers. You don't have to worry about anything. And so I'm glad they're doing this. I think this is huge for our enterprise customers that are using that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And now over to you, Mike. Can you tell our listeners who you are and what you do at Microsoft?
Yeah, thanks for having me. My name is Mike Budzynski. I'm a senior product manager for Azure API management.
What does API management do other than managing APIs? Like as a user, why should I care?
Yeah, that's a great question. APIs are the communication protocol that connects various digital experiences, could be connected smart devices, could be applications, to backend services. And as technology started eating the world, the APIs proliferated, and there's so many APIs right now, it becomes hard to manage those APIs. And that led to creation of API management platforms. And API management platforms fulfill three different roles. One is they act as a facade. So you can think of them as a wall that hides your APIs from the consumers. So anyone who is consuming your APIs doesn't go directly to your APIs. They just hit the wall, and that wall is an API management service. The second role that API management services fulfill is a single entry point to your APIs. So in that wall, you have a certain door that all the API requests go through. And that allows you to mediate all of these API requests. So you can specify certain rules like authenticate those requests, protect your APIs, maybe throttle, accelerate your APIs with caching, and so on. And the last role that API management platforms fulfill is a frictionless consumption. So they allow you to productize your APIs to external consumers. Could be external application developers, could be application developers within your organization, and they create a self-onboarding point for those APIs. In short, Azure API Management is an API management solution that's offered by Azure, built into Azure ecosystem, and integrates well with all the other Azure services out there.
It's really cool, Mike. So one question I would have is, as a developer who's thinking about like the data flow in my application, should I think about these application management interfaces as like a termination point? Like, is it like proxying my requests, or is it like transparent to my underlying application that's running underneath this?
Yeah, so typically what you would do is if you're implementing an application, you probably have it scattered, considering microservice architecture, you probably have it implemented with, let's say, a bunch of Azure functions, maybe app services, maybe Kubernetes, but there is a set of services that power your application. API management sits on top of those services, so that all the API requests go first to API management, and then API management routes those particular API requests to a specific service backend implementation.
And so like the authentication and things like that. So for instance, if I have, like you just said, maybe I have some app services, maybe I have some Kubernetes stuff. So could I like terminate like the authentication part, like having them authenticate to this management, this interface, and then at those lower levels, I don't have to have them like authenticating down there as well?
Exactly. So that's one of the key value propositions. We have a concept called policies. So you can apply a policy on the incoming requests or outgoing responses. One of the policies could be, for example, validation of a JOT token, could be validation of a certificate, could be validation of a basic authentication. But there are also other policies such as caching, throttling, transformation of requests and responses, and so on. But essentially what they offer is they shift off certain responsibilities from the backend implementation to the API management platform, so that you can also unify them across all of your APIs that you have. Instead of implementing JOT token validation in all of your backend services, you can just implement it once in Azure API Management and then reuse it across all the APIs. It also simplifies reactions. So let's say your services are under a certain attack and you want to implement a throttling. So imagine implementing throttling on the backend services and rolling it out to production. That could take a long time. But with Azure API Management, you can just implement it as a one-line policy and deploy it to production within seconds.
Mike, how should the developers think about SSL certificates when it comes to API management? You just have to provision one for the API management endpoint, or is there an option to have it pass through? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, so SSL certificates are, you upload them to API management. So API management does the job for you. There is no pass-through because we need to read the whole request and response. So that certificate needs to be in API management.
So there are applications that are, that are checking for example, for a specific SSL feature on the incoming request. They should not do that, correct? Or can the request be re-encrypted by API management before it sends it to the backend?
Yeah, so these are very dive deep questions. So when you think about the flow of an API request, there is various ways it needs to be authenticated. So first, the request to API manager needs to be authenticated. It could be authenticated with a SSL certificate, JWT token, basic authentication, API key, whatever you choose. And then there's another authentication from API manager to the backend service. And that authentication can also be done with a mutual certificate, could be done with something else, could be with a JWT token or whatever. So there are two places where you need to secure that traffic.
I know we were talking about VNets in the beginning. Where does APIM usually sit within a virtual network, or what? How do you combine the concept of me wanting it to be within some sort of border within my corporation versus how do I think about if this API is to be consumed by external users? Like, how do I do that, and how do I think about that?
Yes, in enterprise scenarios, API management usually sits inside the virtual network. You can have it fully internal so that all of the traffic happens internally inside the virtual network. Don't even expose API management to the internet. But you can also expose it to the internet to external consumers through, for example, application gateway, Azure Application Gateway. So there are two configuration options, fully internal or exposed to the internet. You can also have both internal consumers and external consumers in one API management service, where you would also expose it through an application gateway, but limit certain traffic only through the application gateway to the internet.
One other question on the authentication, sorry, I'm harping on that one a little bit, but if somebody was using like a JWT token or something and they authenticated to the gateway, can the gateway that's talking to the backend services use like managed identities to basically make sure that that's a secure channel between the gateway here for this API management and my backend services? Or how can I secure that if I'm not passing my users to authenticate directly over there?
Exactly. There is a variety of authentication methods that you can use to secure traffic from API management to the backend services. One of them is managed identity. We do support managed identity, so you can easily authenticate to other Azure services. You can also retrieve a JWT token from somewhere. You can also pass the same JWT token if you want to. It's allowed. Certificates are another option. Basic authentication is another option. So basically, any authentication method that you might want to use.
And Mike, what is the overhead that API management would incur? Like, I'm just thinking about a scenario where that is the main entry point to your application, right? And you're getting, I don't know, tens of thousands or whatever, a very high load of requests. Should the developer be thinking about, okay, there's going to be some overhead on this call now, because it's going through an extra hop? Should that be factored in, or that's fairly negligible in your mind?
Yeah, so there is an extra hop. The added latency is very minimal. It's probably around a few milliseconds, so it shouldn't be a concern for most of the people out there. Of course, the more policies you specify, the more latency there is. So for example, we have some computation heavy policies, like if you want to deserialize the whole payload of the request and perform certain operations. For example, if it's JSON, you want to transform it. Of course, that will consume more time and more computing power, and will add latency to your APIs. But you will do that anyway, probably in the backend services. So the overall latency is probably more or less the same.
What does DevOps look like for APIM? Like, do you deploy policy each time you have a new deployment, or is there code? What does that look like?
We have a special tool called DevOps Resource Kit for Azure API Management, which allows you to fully automate deployments of API management services. This DevOps story is very flexible. It is hard to configure at first, or at least may look overwhelming, but it's very flexible in a way that it allows you to have as many environments as you want to have. It also allows you to have as many instances of each environment as you want to have, which means that, for example, you can have 10 different API development teams working on different APIs, and then merging those changes into the production configuration without conflicting with each other. So it's a very powerful tool that you can use to automate deployments within your organization.
One other question to follow on with what Sajid was talking about, not just the scaling piece of it, thinking about it from that perspective, but also like pricing. Is this something that's like priced on a per request basis? Is this like tiered pricing? Like, how do I pay for Gateway?
Great question. We have both options available to you. So we do have a consumption tier, which is a serverless tier that's mostly meant for use with other serverless services like Azure Functions, for example. It is built per execution, per API call. There is a certain amount of calls that you get for free every month. I believe it's 1 million API calls a month. And it does have a curated feature set, and it also runs on a shared infrastructure. So essentially the same as how functions work. When it comes to other tiers of API management, they're all dedicated. So there is a monthly fee, or could be hourly, depending how you are built. But there is a subscription fee that you pay, and you get certain features depending on which tier of the service you choose.
I do recall when using API management a while ago, there's this concept of the developer portal, right? Where I guess you can expose your APIs and allow other application developers to use them. And so, can you speak about some of those features of API management and what's being done in that space recently?
Yes, developer portal is that component that allows the frictionless consumption, which I mentioned at the start. It's essentially a website builder. So you create a website that contains documentation of your APIs. It also lets application developers discover those APIs. So imagine you're a big organization that has 1,000 APIs. There is difficulty in discovering those APIs. So you can use the developer portal, search functionality, tags, etc., to find the API that you need. Once you find it, you can browse the API reference. You can try the API out interactively from the developer portal. There is an interactive console that you can make a test call to see how the API behaves. And of course, finally, if you want to use it, you can request access to an API. And once you request access, you can then manage your account, manage your access, and also see your API usage, how many API calls your application's made, and how that looks like, the whole report of your API usage. When it comes to developer portal, we released a completely new developer portal, I believe in 2019, November 2019. So it's been a year and a half now. It's a very powerful tool, very well adopted as well. So I highly encourage you to try it out. And when it comes to developer portals, they could be, depending on whom you expose your APIs to, they could be fully internal, so within your organization, but they can also be external, so to the internet, if you want to expose your API to external consumers, and maybe you want to create some new line of business that way. Of course, there is also middle ground where you want to expose your API to, for example, selected partners, and all of that you can do with a developer portal that we provide inside Azure API Management Service.
Yeah, with that exposing to the public internet, so if I wanted to expose an API that's being used by, I don't know who's going to use it, right? I'm exposing this API to the public. You mentioned like we can do API keys and things like that to basically throttle people, make sure that they don't tax the service too much. My question is like on the e-commerce piece, can I build a solution on this that allows me to charge customers? Like, do I get the telemetry back to say like, hey, Sajid, you called my API 15 times this month and I'm going to charge you X. Is any of that built into the gateway or the
Yes.
product? Yeah.
So when you think about monetization of APIs, there are two ways you can monetize APIs. You can monetize them per consumption. So for example, per number of API calls or per bandwidth transferred through your APIs, or you can monetize them per subscription basis. So on a certain fixed fee in a given period of time. We do have concepts that allow you to do both, or maybe even a hybrid approach if you want to. We have a concept of a product that lets you bundle your APIs and offer them to consumers, and that could be used for a subscription fee, a subscription-based monetization. For consumption-based monetization, we provide you as a service administrator with API reports that you can inspect to see how much API calls were made by a certain user and how much bandwidth they transferred. So you can do either of them, or you can combine them to create both.
And does that? Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. In fact, we are also working on a few pieces of content around monetization. There is a blog post from several years ago, but we are planning to soon launch a new blog post about it.
Yeah, I was just going to ask further, like, if I build this and use this technology to expose my API, can I also turn around and maybe, if you can say, like in the Azure Marketplace, right, where people come in and they could discover it very easily over there, as opposed to like having to know who I am, go to this certain endpoint,
Yeah, currently that's not available.
Okay, cool.
What is there what's the roadmap looking like for API management, especially anything that you can discuss publicly at this point?
I'm not sure if, let me think. I don't know.
That's
how much
okay.
I
didn't mean to stump you with that
I
question.
didn't check the notes, but like at Ignite, we just had a big conference. I don't know if you guys had any announcements there. Maybe that's a.
We did not. We are planning announcements around the build timeframe. So in May, you should expect to hear about some of the features that we are working on. Unfortunately, none of them are publicly announced yet, so I cannot share them with you.
So
No
close.
worries. That means yeah.
Like what you were describing the whole developer portal experience. It reminds me of Swagger. Like, how are they similar and different?
Yeah, so Swagger UI is a static documentation site that contains API reference pages. We provide a whole platform for building an API ecosystem. So we have a concept of users, we have a concept of binding APIs that you can request access to. We have a concept of telemetry for APIs. So Swagger is just a tiny piece of what we offer.
And that's not called Open API, right? I think Swagger, that's the same thing.
So yeah, I believe what you were referring to was Swagger UI, which is a product that's a documentary APIs. Swagger per se is a specification. Now Open API specification is the previous name for Open API specification, which is the most adopted format for describing your APIs.
Does that, like with the API documentation, does that mean that developers have to use like a framework or some libraries when they're building their actual application? Let's say they're using ASP.NET or something like that. Do they have to do something special, or is it all done through like the dev portal and through this other interface?
Yeah, not at all. We are backend agnostic, so your backend services can be implemented in any language you want, as long as they're available as an HTTP endpoint. When it comes to using the APIs, we provide code samples in a variety of languages in the developer portal. We provide, for example, Python code samples, JavaScript, C#, and so on. So these are just APIs. You can consume them from any framework you want. It's the beauty of APIs that are agnostic when it comes to frameworks or programming languages.
What, and this is not that we don't want people to go use API management, but sort of as I hear you describe this, it seems like almost everybody would want to use it, right? If you've got some sort of REST API for your interface. Are there scenarios where you generally recommend people don't use API management, or is it really and truly, hey, you should always be looking at this as part of your solution?
That's a great question. I think API management should almost always be considered, especially when you either develop applications and publish applications or manage your APIs, when you want to productize your APIs. One scenario that you wouldn't necessarily want to use it is if you have very service-to-service communication. For that purpose, there are service meshes for microservices. That's probably not a scenario where you would like to use Azure API management. But if you externalize your APIs, or if you want to manage them, or even in integration scenarios, it adds a lot of value that and a lot of benefits.
Yeah, I will. You were talking about throttling up front, and I will just share in my world, right? The sort of the world I live where everything's broken. The throttling is one of those things that it's super hard to do right. And so definitely, if people are heading on that route, definitely recommend looking at, APIM.
Yeah.
If obviously for lots of other reasons as well, but that's one that, man, if you get it wrong, your site will fall over, your APIs will fall over because they don't get throttled correctly, or you'll over throttle, right? And you'll do something that'll sort of hurt your downstream customers unexpectedly.
Yeah, we have a bunch of features around protection security. We just released, I think that was announced at Ignite, request and response validation policies. So coming back to this Open API specification, every API is described in some format, and the description contains headers, query parameters, schemas of the requests and responses, and so on. And we released a bunch of policies that allow you to validate the incoming requests and outgoing responses against this definition of the API. So you can protect your API from any abusive traffic and potential attacks. And that's a very powerful feature that you don't need to implement, and implementation of that would take you a long time.
Yeah, Kale, sorry, just to answer your question earlier about how you consume these APIs, I've used a tool called AutoRest, which essentially takes the Open API or the Swagger specification as an input, and it can generate, your client sort of SDK or library in any number of languages, and that works pretty good.
To your point, we also have a Visual Studio Code extension that allows you to scaffold Azure functions from an Open API specification in Azure API management. And that uses AutoRest as the underlying technology.
One other question I don't think we touched on here yet was around telemetry, right? So if I'm exposing an API and I want to know what's popular, like what are people using, those kind of things, is there specific like hooks and things built into the product that allow me to use things like log analytics and things like that?
Yeah, so we have built-in API reports that show the service administrators an overview of your APIs. But for runtime traffic inspection, we do have a bunch of tools and ways to observe it. One of the most common ones is integration with Azure Application Insights. We also integrate with Azure Monitor. We also have a log to Event Hub policy if you want to log certain information to Event Hub and consume it from Event Hub for very specific and advanced scenarios. Lastly, we also have in the Visual Studio Code extension, we have a debugging tool that you can fully debug the policy flow. So if we talked about those policies, you may want to apply just a few of them, but in more advanced scenarios, we see policy files that have hundreds of lines of code. And for that, we incorporated policy debugging feature into Visual Studio Code extension so that you can put breakpoints and inspect intermediary values as you go through the policy execution flow.
Yeah, the other question I had was around, sorry, it's my last one, but around transformation of requests. You mentioned there's some flexibility there. So, I mean, I assume things like HTTP headers could be like, basically enrich the request as it's coming through or added. But how far can you go with that, right? Is it something you can actually write some code over there to have it go do a lookup and do all kinds of other things? Or what's the limits there of like what you can do?
Yeah, we allow, so we have those policies which are expressed in XML file, and we also allow for injection of C# code inside the policy file. There are certain libraries that we allow only, so not every piece of C# code, but you can inject pretty advanced logic written in the C# inside the policy file. We do support transformations for the bodies, for the headers, for the query parameters. You can deserialize JSON payloads, or you can easily convert XML to JSON or JSON to XML with just one line policy. It's a very powerful engine that you can use to transform those requests and responses. There are, of course, some limits to it, but I would say that it's very powerful and should suffice for most of the scenarios. For certain scenarios that it may not be sufficient, we also have a policy that lets you make a call out to another service. So you can implement certain logic in, for example, Azure Function, and then make a call out from Azure API Management to an Azure function, receive the response back, and then continue processing your request.
That's been great, really cool. Cynthia, I think we should wrap it up here.
Yeah, I was gonna say, any last questions for Mike before we let him go?
No questions. I highly encourage all of you to try Azure API Management out. It's a great service, simplifies your life a lot, and it's available even for free if you are under 1 million calls in the consumption tier.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Mike, for coming on the show. And we'll definitely include some of the resources that you mentioned in our show notes. And we will see everyone next week.
Thanks,
Awesome.
Mike.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike.